And today, as I said, we're starting a brand new series of sermons. And every week we're learning about a major branch of the Christian faith. Now, please understand that I know this. By no means am I an expert on all of the branches of the Christian tradition that we're going to be talking about today. And in no way, shape, or form can we really do justice to each tradition, especially in the new and improved and shortened Ryan Gear sermons. There's just no way that we can cover everything that we need to do. By the way, do you see this bright red glow radiating from the back? Can people see what that is? That is a digital clock with 4-inch numbers. Somebody told me the other day, they're like, we don't really mind the length of your sermons, but you keep looking at your watch. They're like, it makes me nervous. So we got this clock to keep us on track. All right, so you understand that we can't possibly do justice to all of the branches that we're talking about in this series, but we're going to do our best. And today, we're starting the series with the largest Christian body in the world, the Roman Catholic Church. And every week, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to give you some facts and history about each denomination. Then we'll look at the major tenets of their faith, what they believe. And then we'll look at what we can learn, for at least a few of the things we can learn from this tradition. And this is a series that's a part of Lent. And so the main goal that we have is that somehow we would be able to reflect and grow in our relationship with Jesus by learning about these different traditions. Lent means spring, but it's a season of preparation for Easter, when we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus all over again. And so Lent is a period of time for us to prepare ourselves to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. So every week we want to ask, how can I learn something and grow to be more like Jesus in my character and prepare to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus all over again. We don't have to pretend to be perfect. We don't have to pretend like we have no problems. We say around here, no perfect people allowed. The reason for that is we're growing. We believe in sanctification, sanctifying grace, that over time God grows us in our character. So I don't have to pretend to be perfect because I'm growing. And Lent is an opportunity to do that. 1 year in, journalists are writing about the Francis effect. Has anybody heard that? Pope Francis was elected a little over a year ago as the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And the Francis effect is that apparently attendance in Mass is increasing all over the world because of Francis. He models humbleness. He is about serving the poor. He's addressing issues that have plagued the church for a while. And I think Pope Francis really represents the Catholic Church at its best. I applaud him. I'm a fan. I think I follow him on Twitter, actually. You know, the Pope tweets now. Isn't that cool? And so Pope Francis is having a great effect on the Catholic Church, and I think that's something that we can all appreciate. Now, last week, a guy visiting our 1 year celebration came up to me after the service outside, and we were eating yogurt. And he said that he's Catholic. His name is Pat. He said he's Catholic. And he appreciated the fact that in my announcement last week about this series, I didn't bash the Catholic Church. He said, thanks for not doing that. I said some positive things. He said he's been to Protestant churches before, and he's actually heard anti-Catholic statements, like out of nowhere. Like, why would they even say that? And he appreciated the fact that I didn't make anti-Catholic statements in the service last week. And so I want you to know going in, this series is not about this is why we're not that. That's not what we're doing in this series. We're not going to take a look at the Catholic Church and somehow argue about why one church is a Protestant church. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're viewing the church in the most fair light possible, and we're going to learn about them, and then we're going to ask, what can we gain from that? And my invitation to you, especially as we begin with the Catholic Church, would be, although you may not agree with Catholic beliefs in some areas, my invitation would be, could we develop an appreciation for why Catholics believe what they believe and understand why it is, because it is a system. There is a lot of logic there. It's a system that makes sense together to understand why Catholics believe what they believe, and then learn from them in a way that can grow us in our faith. Does that sound fair? Okay, that's where we're headed in this series. Unfortunately, there's been a long history of anti-Catholic bias in the United States. It reached a pinnacle during Prohibition, actually. Interesting, Prohibition. If you know your American history, you know that Prohibition was not entirely about alcohol. Prohibition was also influenced by some anti-Catholic feelings and some anti-immigrant feelings. What had happened in the 1800s, a great number of Irish Catholics had immigrated to the States, along with German Lutherans. And there was already a group of people who were opposed to alcohol, and they stereotyped Irish Catholics and German Lutherans as not being against alcohol. And so you had, in the Prohibition, you had people, it was a coalition in America, people who were against alcohol, but then you also had people who were anti-Catholic. You see how that works? It's a political coalition. We don't like the Irish Catholics, so now they're Protestants who are anti-Catholic. And then, well, they're immigrants. We don't like immigrants either. So Prohibition was about more than alcohol. It was a political coalition of anti-alcohol, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, all rolled up into one. How many of you are like, I didn't know this was history class today? Thanks, Ryan. But unfortunately, that's a part of our history as a country. Back in 1960, a candidate wanted to run for president who was a Roman Catholic, was JFK. And JFK had to give a major religion and state speech to prove to everybody that he wouldn't be controlled by the Pope. Because there was this anti-Catholic bias in America, and they were afraid that JFK would be controlled by the Pope instead of pledging his allegiance to the United States. Now, looking back, we know that JFK was not exactly a model Catholic. Those fears were probably unfounded to begin with. But it was part of the anti-Catholic bias. Now, hopefully, a lot of that has gone to the margins of society. I hope that's the case. And so again, my invitation today is to consider what Catholics believe and why, and how we can grow from that. So if you want to take notes in your worship handout, there's a place where you can take notes on the back as we follow along. First, some facts and some history about the Catholic Church, and of course we can't cover all of it. The Roman Catholic Church is the largest Christian body in the world, with over 1.2 billion, with a B, billion members. Catholics represent half, or over half, of all Christians in the world. Do you know that? Over half. Catholicism is also the largest religion in the United States and the largest religion in Arizona. It's one of the most enduring institutions in the world. On July 4th, the United States will be 238 years old. The Catholic Church has existed 8 times longer than the United States. Isn't that interesting? And has 3 times as many members as the United States has in our population. The word Catholic comes from the Greek word kathalu, which means universal. When you say Catholic Church, it's a Greek word. What you're saying is universal church. The Catholic Church sees itself as the universal church of Jesus all over the world. Catholics view the Apostle Peter as the first pope and establishing what's called apostolic succession, that after every pope, it's an unbroken chain of apostolic authority that gets passed down from pope to pope. Pope means papa, which is Latin for father. The Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church, and Catholics believe that Jesus established the papacy with the Apostle Peter in Matthew chapter 16. So we're going to read that scripture. And this scripture means a lot to me. Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, which is in northern Israel, close to Syria and Lebanon, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" So Jesus referred to himself often in the third person as the Son of Man. "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets, like a prophet's come back to life." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter," which in Greek is Petros. It means rock. "And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So Jesus says to Simon, "I tell you, you are Petros, you are rocky, and on this rock I will build my church." So for Catholics, they're viewing that as the installation of Peter as the first pope, the rock on whom the church is built. Now, Protestants have a different interpretation of that, but this passage is very meaningful to me. Can you see why, as somebody who was going to move to Arizona to start a new church? Jesus says, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades or the gates of death will not overcome it. I had the opportunity to go to Israel about 2 months before Hannah and I moved here in early 2012 to start this church. And this is a rock from Caesarea Philippi. And Israeli customs didn't stop me, so I assume they're cool with this. And I picked up this rock to remind me that Jesus says, whether it's Peter, certainly Peter was a leader in the early church. He was the primary leader after Jesus in the early church. So whether Peter is the rock or the profession of faith that Jesus is the Messiah is the rock, either way, Jesus says, I will build my church. This is the rock, and I will build my church. And nothing will prevail against it. You can see why that would be encouraging to me. Why I love this passage. We just celebrated our 1-year anniversary yesterday, and Jesus is building his church all over the world, and the gates of death are not prevailing against it. Some of the names and structure within the Catholic Church come from Roman culture. A Roman city hall, like the town hall, was called a basilica. A cathedral comes from the Latin word cathedra, which means chair or throne. And so the Roman emperor sat on a chair or throne, and it was a symbol of the emperor's authority. So now when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, how many of you heard that before? Ex cathedra, he's speaking from the chair, from the throne, and it means that his word is binding and infallible for Catholic Christians. It means, or for the Catholic Church, it means that what he's saying is true in matters of faith and morality, and Catholics should follow that. He has power somewhat like the emperor had. When he speaks, it's a different kind of power because the Pope wants to follow Christ. That's a very different kind of power than the emperor used. But when he speaks ex cathedra, he's speaking from the chair like the emperor did. A famous pope in Catholic history is Pope Gregory the Great. He lived in the 500s AD. Gregory the Great had such a revolutionary influence on the liturgy of the Catholic Church that you would begin to recognize, if you were looking back in history, about 550, 600 AD, you would be able to look at a service under the leadership of Gregory the Great and say, oh, that's Catholic. He had such an influence on the liturgy that he created what we would recognize as modern Catholicism. There's some question about his influence on worship music. He may have been revolutionary in worship music as well and developing a kind of chant. What kind of chant would be connected with Gregory? Gregorian chant. Another revolutionary moment in Catholic history took place in 1054 AD. In 1054, a separation took place within the universal church. This was 1,000 years after Jesus. The church was split in two, according to East and West. And what we know as the Catholic Church was the Western part of that. The Eastern part is what we know as the Orthodox Church, which we're talking about next week. It's called the Great Schism, the Great Separation in 1054 AD. This week, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in Crimea in Ukraine, right? If Russia truly does overtake Crimea, the Catholics in Crimea are very concerned because what might happen is the Catholic churches might be confiscated and they may be forced to either become Orthodox or to leave the country because that division is still in world politics even now. The Great Schism is still affecting world politics. In the 1500s, the Protestant Reformation took place, led by a Catholic monk named Martin Luther who left the church. And Luther and others protested certain elements of Catholicism, so they became known as Protestants. And major reforms were made, by the way, after that in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church of today is much different than the Catholic Church then, so we don't blame Catholics today for problems that existed 500 years ago. Major reforms were made once again in the Catholic Church in the 1960s in what's called the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II. It modernized the church in several ways, and the most famous is probably permitting Mass to be said in the language of the people. So over the world before that, the Mass was said in Latin. After Vatican II, like if you speak Spanish, the priest will say the Mass in Spanish. If you speak English, the priest will say the Mass in English. So the Catholic Church is continually reforming itself. So let's go to number 2 and look at major distinctives of Catholic faith. And like I said, of course, we're not going to be able to cover Catholic theology. If you want to learn about the Catholic Church, you can do that very easily now. If you go to the Vatican website, it's vatican.va, you could read the entire catechism of the Roman Catholic Church. You could learn everything you wanted to know. A lot of Protestants bash Catholics because they don't understand what Catholics even believe. You hear a lot of ignorance. Ignorance is the parent of prejudice. And so you could learn about Catholic theology online at vatican.va. I occasionally house sit for my neighbor, Tom. And Tom and his wife are semi-retired, and they travel the world. So like every other month, they're like, oh, we're going to Acapulco now. I'm like, must be nice. I'll be here in Chandler for you. And they travel several times a year, and they're kind enough to ask me to house sit for them. His wife is still employed as a chaplain, however, and they're a great Catholic couple. And a few months ago, I was house sitting, and I was looking down this hallway, and I saw a picture of his wife talking with Pope John Paul II. That's not usual, So like they came back, and I'm like, by the way, like, how did Patty get to hang out with the Pope? Like, tell me the story there, man. And he said that Patty took a group of mentally challenged students to Rome, to the Vatican. And what an amazing opportunity for them, and that's a challenging trip to lead. It's the kind of person she is. And they took these kids to Rome, and somebody's like, why don't we see if we could meet the Pope? That's a really optimistic person right there. Like, that's the kind of positive thinking you want, in your group. So they called up the Vatican, and they're like, hey, we're, like, I'm Mike, and we're over here from America. We'd like to visit the Pope. So the person on the other end says, well, we'll check into it. They get a call back. They're like, how's Thursday at 1? What? And so they took all these kids to the Vatican, and they got to have an audience with Pope John Paul II. Amazing, privilege, just very, very rare thing. And so there's a picture of Patty with the Pope. Now, Tom and I occasionally talk religion. And, we shoot the breeze about the weather, and then he kind of moves on to religion, that kind of thing. And he and I have great talks, and he's a faithful church-going Catholic. They love their church, and so does his wife. And at the same time, they don't agree with every single thing that their church teaches. Now, I'm just going to go way out on a limb here. I wonder at times if it's possible that people in one church don't agree with every single thing I say. I wonder, right? And the Catholic Church realizes that they're a big tent. They're worldwide. They're diverse. And in my experience, knowing friends who are Catholic, I think it's actually a strength of the Catholic Church that there seems to be some latitude to allow people to hold different opinions and to live in different ways, but they can still be Catholic. I think that's a very powerful trait. And so we talk about these beliefs in that spirit, that not all Catholics agree with Catholic theology, but we want to learn what the Catholic Church teaches. So a few things. First of all, the Mass. The most important aspect of Catholic theology is the Mass. It's considered a sacrifice. And it's, according to the Catechism, it's the source and summit of life in the Church. The word Mass comes from the Latin dismissal at the end of the service. Mass, or the Eucharist, or communion, or the Lord's Supper is the central act of worship in the Christian church, and Catholics emphasize its importance well. Now, the Mass is a sacrifice in Catholic theology because Catholics believe that Christ is truly present in the elements of bread and wine. When Jesus says, "Take, eat, this is my body," Catholics take that literally, that this is the body and blood of Christ. So to Catholics, when an ordained priest announces the words of institution, they believe that the bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ in essence. Now, obviously, they know that in physical properties, the bread and wine is still bread and wine. But in essence, Catholics believe that it's transformed into the body and blood of Christ, and that is based on the philosophy of Aristotle. It's not something they pulled out of thin air. It's based on a philosophy that understands there's a difference between something's physical properties and its essence. So the elements really do become the body and blood of Christ, and Christ is present with them, and Christ is sacrificed. The love of Jesus is shown again in the Mass. Sometimes a server will ring altar bells when the priest says the words of institution. That used to be an old tradition, I think, that kind of went away, and maybe it's coming back in some churches. And that signals the change. So the Mass is sacrifice. Next, communion of the saints. The communion of the saints means that the church believes that everybody who follows Jesus lives eternally. Do Protestants believe that? Yes, we do. And so it means that everybody who follows Jesus now on earth is a part of the communion, the gathering of the saints, people who want to follow Jesus, and everybody who's lived before that, everybody who's lived and died and passed on, they're a part of the communion of the saints as well. And Catholics believe in the intercession of the saints. So Catholics don't really pray. Some of the things that I'm addressing are common prejudices that Protestants have against Catholics. And I'm trying to bring a little corrective there. Catholics don't pray to the saints, they pray through the saints. That the saints are there in heaven with Jesus. And I'm being simplistic here, but, well, they're there, so maybe they can ask Jesus for some things too. They can intercede on our behalf. And so Catholics will pray through the intercession of the saints. Does that make sense? Well, you may agree or disagree with that, but we're trying to understand where Catholics are coming from. Because they believe that all people who follow Jesus live eternally. And they're there. Well, why wouldn't we ask them to intercede on our behalf? Purgatory. The Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory, which means an intermediate state between this life and heaven, comes from a book called Second Maccabees about making atonement for the dead so that they might be freed from sin. Second Maccabees is a part of what Protestants call the Apocrypha. It's a group of books that were largely composed between the writing of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And if you become a participating member of one church, we give you a study Bible. That study Bible contains the Apocrypha. So it's a Bible, it's an academic Bible that Catholics use, that Jews use, that Protestants used. And the Apocrypha is not included in the Protestant Bible. So why don't Protestants believe in purgatory? Because it's not in the Protestant Bible, but it is in the Catholic Bible. And so Catholics would simply cite a scripture from 2 Maccabees about purgatory. Purgatory is an intermediate state, again, where people destined for heaven are purified for their sins. Okay, the veneration of Mary. Are you still with me? Is this interesting? I wish that more people in our society were willing to understand like you are. And we would have a lot less problems over religion and religious wars, wouldn't we? Wouldn't that be great? What about the veneration of Mary? Some Protestants will mistakenly claim that Catholics worship Mary. That's not true. Catholics refer to Mary as the Blessed Virgin, the Blessed Virgin Mary, Our Lady, our Blessed Lady, and is the Mother of God. Mary is the mother of Jesus. And if Protestants weren't, not all Protestants, of course, but some Protestants, if Protestants weren't reacting against the Catholic Church, wouldn't it be natural to think that Jesus' mother is a really big deal? Isn't that kind of natural? The person who gave birth to Jesus, that person's a big deal. And Catholics are simply developing a belief system that acknowledges the importance of her role. Her role in salvation has been written about extensively in Catholic theology, and there's some latitude in that. The Catholics don't worship Mary. They do give Mary the highest honor. That's a designation. They give highest honor to Mary, and because of the communion of the saints, Mary's one of the saints, so Catholics can ask Mary to intercede and pray to Jesus on their behalf. And by showing devotion to Mary, they can ask her to intercede on their behalf. The celibacy of priests. The priesthood is modeled after the life of Jesus. In spite of what the Da Vinci Code said, there's no reason to think that Jesus was married. Dan Brown was drawing on writings that happened 300 years after Jesus, And it's really a misunderstanding of those writings, and then based his book on that. There's no reason to think that Jesus was married, and there's no reason to think that Paul was married. So Catholics look at Jesus and they look at Paul, and they say those are pretty good models for what it means to live the mission of Christ in the world. And so they model the celibacy of priests after Jesus and Paul. Now, celibacy became a requirement gradually for Catholic priests over hundreds of years, and it culminated in the 1100s AD, when it was declared officially that Catholic priests must be celibate. Recently, Pope Francis did refer to this because somebody asked him a question about it. And he essentially said, it's not the faith in the sense that it's not something that we've held on to from the beginning, but it's a 1,000-year tradition, which is important in the Catholic Church. So there is a difference in the celibacy of priests from the other doctrines that we've talked about. You see the difference? It wasn't in the earliest belief of Christians, but it is a long tradition. And tradition is important in the Roman Catholic Church. So those are a few of the things that Roman Catholics hold as very, very important to their faith that Protestants often misunderstand. Now, to the third and final section. What can we learn from the Catholic Church, the largest Christian body in the world? And I could make a very, very long list. First of all, I think we could learn something about social justice. The Catholic Church has an extensive, developed doctrine of social justice. And Catholic social justice doctrine asserts the dignity and equality of all human beings. It values diversity. It urges societies to address social and economic inequalities, like the widening gap between the rich and the poor currently in America. And it calls those inequalities sinful. It says God did not intend for society to be stratified between the haves and the have-nots. And as people who want to follow Jesus, we should do something about that. It encourages love for our brothers and sisters. Many of us here who are Protestant grew up in churches that cared about people's souls, but not their bodies. It was all about saving souls. It was like an evacuation plan to get out of here. The world's going to burn, so we're catching the elevator out of here. And it was about saving people's souls, but not so much their bodies. Not so in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church values social justice. In the last church I served in, before we moved here to start this church, we actually, as a Protestant church, we actually partnered with the Roman Catholic parish in town. It was a really, really cool thing. They operated the food pantry in our town, and the church I served in operated the clothing, clothing store. It was free store in our town. And so we would send people over to St. Matthew's Catholic parish for food, and they would send people over to our church building for clothing. Isn't that cool? And I remember a time when a couple of guys came in from St. Matthew's, and they came into the church office, and they said that a family had a house fire. And they lost everything. And these guys at St. Matthew's were driving around the different churches in town because they had given food, but they didn't keep the clothing and furniture and all that kind of thing. And these guys from St. Matthew's were driving around, Catholics, Protestants, and gathering up items. You know, Catholics and Protestants working together to help this family who had lost everything. Isn't that cool? That may not have been possible 50 or 100 years ago, but the Catholics have set a great example in matters of social justice. The second thing we could learn from Catholics, an appreciation for science. Now, if you realize this or not, the Catholic Church, in its theology, sees faith and science as compatible. The Catholic Church officially sees faith and evolution as compatible. Were you aware of that? Were you aware of that? And many of us grew up in churches where we know that one of the greatest battles in the culture war is between fundamentalists and science, that Christians can't take science seriously, or Christians can't believe in the theory of evolution. Not so with the Catholic Church. I mean, there are stories from a few hundred years ago with Galileo, but the Catholic Church learned. Gregor Mendel was a Catholic monk who pioneered genetics, which are kind of important today. All the study of DNA, that was a Catholic monk who began that work. George Lemaitre was a Belgian Catholic priest and a contemporary of Einstein who proposed the theory of the Big Bang. The theory of the Big Bang was proposed by a Belgian Catholic priest. because the Catholic Church is open to scientific inquiry. I think we have a lot to learn in the Christian world in America from that belief. And then finally, we'll park here for a couple of minutes. I think that one of the most important things we can learn from the Catholic faith is an understanding of the majesty of God, and to be in awe of God and God's presence, and see all of our lives in light of the majesty of God, and then be able to grow and pray and reflect and contemplate and experience God's peace, experience God's healing, God's wholeness. And I think the Roman Catholic Church probably gets that better than any group of Christians in the world. There are times in life when you need a big God, right? Family here in our church just went through a son having a motorcycle accident about a month ago. When you get a call from a hospital that your son has been in a motorcycle accident, you need a majestic God, don't you? And I think of walking into a Catholic cathedral and you see maybe Jesus in the rotunda with the disciples, and you see this awe-inspiring feeling of, wow, God's a big God. And there are times in life when you really need a big God. Have you ever been to St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan? And you can be in the hustle and bustle of New York, and Rockefeller Center is across the street, and then you walk into St. Patrick's Cathedral, and it's just hushed. Isn't that cool? There's like this feeling of reverence. There's like this silence and the presence of this awesome, majestic, big God. It's a place of peace, even in the hustle and bustle of Manhattan. Personally, when I want to get away, and I want to pray and reflect and dream, and think about what does God want with my life in one church, I gravitate to Catholic cathedrals and retreat centers. Back in Ohio, there was a basilica close to where I lived, and it's called Our Lady of Consolation. There's a shrine of Mary, and for 150 years, people have come to that basilica to pray for physical healing because they believe that God healed through that statue. And I don't know how many times I went there to the basilica to reflect and pray. They were open 24 hours a day. There were times, maybe you've gone through times in life like this where it's 2 a.m. and you can't sleep. And I found in times like that, I need a big, majestic God. And I would get in the car and I would drive to Our Lady of Consolation. And I would sit in the pew. I'd be the only person in there, this cavernous, huge, gorgeous basilica. You smell the incense. And you see the art all surrounding you, and you just feel the awesomeness of God. There are times in life, I can tell you that God did a lot of healing in my life. I've talked about going to professional counseling before, and that was very important. But I'll tell you what, God did a lot of healing in my life, sitting in the pew of a basilica all alone in the middle of the night. God touched me there, met me there. When I lived here from 05 to 07 in Tempe, and I got in touch with a renewal center in Scottsdale. It's called the Franciscan Renewal Center. It's called the Casa also. And it's this beautiful retreat center right next to Camelback Mountain. And they have all these gardens. It's a huge property. They have these beautiful gardens all around in front and back of the property. And there are prayer labyrinths. There's a garden called the Healing Garden. And I would go there. I actually have a picture. There's a swing in the Healing Garden. And you don't know how many things there are about this church that were conceived of sitting in that swing. When I would pray, God, oh man, God, I have all these questions, and I know that I need to grow, and I know I need your healing, and I need your peace, and I would feel anxiety, and I would sit in the middle of the Healing Garden on that swing at the Franciscan Renewal Center, and God met me there. It just seems like the Catholic Church understands the importance of creating space to reflect and pray and grow in the presence of this majestic God and experience God's peace. Do you need God's peace? Do you need God's peace more in your life? Are you carrying something? Is it something weighing you down? Did you walk in here carrying a metaphorical suitcase behind you of anxiety and concerns about life and all these things that are pressing on you? Lent is a perfect time to create space, to just sit and pray and reflect in the presence of this awesome God who can give healing to you on a daily basis, more and more, who can speak peace into your life. You know, all the problems that we think are really big, When we get an idea of the awesomeness of God, those problems start to shrink. How many of you have experienced that? You could face something where you think, oh, this problem is just life-altering. I don't know how I can get through this. But you get into the presence of an awesome God and you realize, oh, that problem's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The presence of an awesome, majestic, all-powerful God shrinks problems. If you haven't experienced that, I wonder if there would be a way during Lent, in preparation for Easter, that you could create a space for reflection and contemplation and prayer. And kind of learn this from the Catholics, to sit in the presence of an awesome God. One more story, and then we're going to close. Back in Ohio when I was in seminary, sometimes I would have a class until like 9 o'clock at night, and the drive was an hour one way back to my house. So I'd be driving on the freeway late at night, and there was a Catholic radio station that I would listen to sometimes. And during this time, it's probably 9:30 p.m., 10 p.m. maybe. And the station was or the show that was on the station at that time were prayers. And a man and woman would alternate saying the Our Father and the Hail Mary. The Our Father is the Lord's Prayer. And the Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. And they would just repeat that. And then they go to the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Had peaceful background music. And they would just alternate repeating those prayers. Like there'd be times driving, it would start to get hypnotic. I'd be like, oh, whoa, wait. But it was so peace-producing. And I realized that even this radio station understands there are rhythms to life. And I think the Catholic Church does this really well. I think they redeem the rhythms of life. To understand morning and midday and nighttime, that you can go to bed at night after praying, and you can go to bed at peace. And then the lectionary and the annual church calendar, I think the Catholic Church has a way of redeeming the rhythms of life and helping us to get on board with what God wants to do with the rhythms of life.